All right, so I'm making a video here of the Sunday sermon because of the coronavirus situation. This is the first time I've ever really tried to use the video capabilities on my PC and figuring out how to get that all on the website and everything. That's all new to me. Generally on PCs I use things like word processing and spreadsheets and databases and maybe internet access, that kind of thing. So this is a little bit new to me. We're going to try it, see how it goes. I am going to probably split this up into 10-minute segments into separate files. That way if something goes wrong, I haven't lost the entire message, just part of it. I do also want to say I am happy to see that it's obvious a number of people have come by the church and picked up the communion, the little individual serving communion cups. That's very encouraging to me. I do hope that the rest of you are either making communion bread at home with grape juice that you have, or found someone who would share that with you. But I do think it's still important that we have the Lord's Supper, even though we can't be in one place, one physical location. That's very crucial that we continue to do that. And so I pray that you will do that. So my sermon for this morning is called Dealing with Plague. Obviously, it's based on what's been going on around us. And the reality is that what we are experiencing is really unprecedented in our lifetimes. It's been called the greatest health crisis of our lifetime, and that's probably an accurate way to put it. This virus is actually much more contagious than most, and it has spread across the world very quickly in a very short period of time. The effects that it has on the body if you are infected are particularly nasty and dangerous. It brings almost pneumonia-like symptoms, and a lot of the people who are dying from it have in fact died because their lungs have filled up and they're simply not able to get enough oxygen as a result. The death rate for this virus is still in much debate, but at this point it seems as though it's been much higher than many other viruses. Although I did hear some encouraging news on that front this morning, that maybe it's not as high as they thought. So that's encouraging. But the numbers coming out of Italy are particularly disturbing in this past week, at least for me, and sobering. Our modern ease of travel has probably increased the spread of this much more quickly than it otherwise would have spread in times past, a few generations ago. But I think we can no longer just brush this off as some kind of overhyped hysteria, because it has now affected all our lives in some pretty major ways, and I think it's going to continue to affect our lives for quite some time. The economic impact of this alone is likely going to last for a while. I don't know how long it's going to be until the stock market begins to rebound, but it's going to take a lot more than just a rebound on the stock market to really say that the economic impact of this is over. Making up for all the lost time in which people have been unemployed, and the lost productivity. Just no way to know how long that really will last. And in fact, we don't know how long the sort of crisis in regards to the disease itself is going to last. And so it's an unprecedented thing in our lifetimes. However, it is far from being unprecedented in the history of the world. And I'd like to begin by just kind of putting this in perspective for us a little bit and talk about some of the other pandemics and epidemics that have happened throughout the history of our world. And so the first one I want to talk about, the most recent one in our recent history, I guess we should say, is the Spanish influenza outbreak of 1918, and really went on through about 1920. It was a pandemic. That is meaning simply a worldwide epidemic. That's what that term means. That, in fact, is what we are experiencing now as a pandemic, because it is a worldwide epidemic. But during that time, somewhere between 30 and 33% of the world was infected, which at that time meant about 500 million people that were infected. And an estimated 50 million, or about 10% of those, died worldwide. In the U.S. alone, 675,000 people died. That was it began at the tail end of World War I, and so the death toll came at a time that we really couldn't afford that, and yet that's when that happened. Before that, they had the Great Plague of London, 1665 to 1666. It was an outbreak of the bubonic plague, and it actually killed 1/4 of the population of London, or about 100,000 people, in a period of about 18 months. During that time, the colleges were shut down, and so some of you might be aware of this. Isaac Newton was working from home during that time because of the plague, and he actually invented calculus during that time, and did some other amazing things during that time. So good things can come out of these periods of time as well. Certainly, I don't think that having calculus mitigates the death of that many people, 100,000 people, but I'm simply saying some positive things can happen even during times like this. The bubonic plague of the 14th century began about 1347 and went on for about 5 years, also called the Black Death. It spread across both Europe and Asia, killed 1/3 of the population of Europe, which was more than 20 million people. And some estimates put it as high as 50% of the population of Eurasia, that is Europe and Asia combined. It had already, by the time it got to Asia, or rather Europe, it had already ravished Asia, parts of the Middle East, and even northern Africa, Egypt in particular. This is all part of what they called this plague of London, and the bubonic plague were part of what they actually called the second pandemic, what historians call the second pandemic. It might make sense, first of all, to talk about what the first and third pandemic. So the third pandemic began in 1855 in China. It killed more than 12 million people in China and India combined, more than 10 million in India alone. And it was actually considered to be active in the world even until 1960, even though really it wasn't active in the way we might think of it today. It certainly was not killing a lot of people during that time, but so for 100 years or so that it was considered to be active. The second pandemic, that Great Plague of London that I mentioned, and the bubonic plague or Black Death of the 14th century, were part of this second plague or second pandemic. And it was actually a series of intermittent pandemics of bubonic plague. The first one was in 1333, and it originated in China, and it lasted until 1750. In total, an estimated during this whole stretch of period of time, so we're talking about 400 years, a little more than 400 years of time, an estimated 450 million people died in that series of plagues. That's called the second pandemic. The first pandemic is also called the plague of Justinian, and it ravished the Byzantine Empire, which is really the eastern part of the Roman Empire. And it lasted from 541 AD to 542, so about a year, but it kept recurring until about 750 AD at various intervals. But it killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people. Obviously, the further you go back in time, the harder these estimates are to be accurate. But that would constitute anywhere from 13 to 26% of the world population in 541. But 40% of the people in Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, died. Now, we could say a whole lot more about these plagues and others that have happened, but the point I want to make is that this is, while this may be unprecedented in our lifetime, it is not unprecedented in world history. Plagues do happen. They tend to come and go. Modern medicine has shielded us from a lot of this and mitigated the results of it. And modern quarantine methods have done a great deal to reduce the effect of these and the spread of some of these things compared to what it used to be. But there are, of course, plagues that go much further back in history than this, and quite a number of them are actually recorded in the scriptures. And what I want to do today is I want to look briefly at what caused these plagues and what brought them to an end, the ones that we find recorded in Scripture. So there's a lot of things a guy could say about all this, but I just want to look at a few of these, and I'll start in the second video segment to look at some of these and see what observations we can draw and what lessons we might be able to learn, look at what caused these plagues and what brought them to an end. And hopefully we can learn some things particularly of a spiritual nature in these things. So that's going to bring this one to an end, and I'm going to start another segment here in just a second.